Introducing Xfinity's breakthrough Wi-Fi speed, now faster than a gig. And with X1, you get access to live TV and top streaming apps. Upgrade today. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY, or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Actual speeds vary, not guaranteed. Requires compatible X-Fi gateway.
Before we begin, we would like to give a massive thank you to the sponsors of today's show, the game June's Journey.
Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. Listener discretion is advised.
Gordon, my boy, I wish you in every way the best of luck, and if you feel inclined, then please do what you can for me. Give to the English public your opinion regarding me, personally, and also in other respects. You have been for 5 years in close contact with me, and so you are quite fit to do so. Friend, keep out of prison, but especially out of this God-forsaken hole. Farewell, Gordon. We likely may never see us again, but let us live in hope that it may be otherwise. Your friend, Oscar Slater. P.S. Please don't forget to write or see Conan D.
I'm Jess, and this is Skinwalker.
Glasgow in 1908 was, for most of its inhabitants, overcrowded, narrow and dirty. Glaswegian men typically worked in factories or in the new Yarrows shipbuilding yard in Scotstoun, which had launched its first of 10 destroyer ships built for the Brazilian Navy that very same year. The women stayed at home and tried to fashion what little they collectively had into something which could sustain a family. In addition to this, most working class families had to live subleased to a tenancy in order to deal with the exorbitant rent rates being charged by overzealous landlords. Glasgow was not the only city feeling the pinch quite so keenly. The impoverished across Britain were being handed a raw deal, packaged as a gift basket. Should they still feel they were not being given a fair crack of the whip, they were provided with a suitable list of targets for their ire from the nation's media and the Aliens Act of 1905. Notably absent on the list was the politicians in charge of improving their circumstances. However, all discontented citizens were informed that their situation would be improved in the absence of the Irish, Jews, and people who weren't white and born in Britain. Hate thy neighbour rhetoric that we like to convince ourselves stopped at some point in 1945, but we regularly still see today. The world of 1908 and today aren't so different as we lead ourselves to believe. Something else which 1908 shared with the modern world is that the struggle felt at the bottom was not distributed evenly across all of the city's inhabitants. Glasgow gave shelter to the destitute in droves, shepherding them into low-income work as they shuffled through the meagre existence the city provided for them. However, it also had a certain allure that appealed to a higher class of residents. Residents who it gave money to spare, which they spent in equal measure, and a standard of living which would be enviable even by today's standards. Living in the beautiful townhouses of the city and working in buildings designed by luminaries such as Arthur the Greek Thomson, there was a vibrant upper class hidden beneath the smog on the Clyde. There were the new money, sharp-suited commodity traders based at the Royal Exchange Building, a building now more famous for the statue in its grounds depicting the Duke of Wellington, and who, thanks to Glasgow's residents, wears a traffic cone on his head. And then there was Glasgow's old money. The people who had lived in Glasgow for generations and in many ways had built Glasgow and gotten fat off the profits. In turn, and in time, so had their children. One such beneficiary was Marion Gilchrist, who in 1908 was based out of a princely and tastefully decorated abode at 49 West Princes Street, Glasgow. Marion Gilchrist was born in Glasgow on January 18, 1826, the daughter of James Gilchrist, a prosperous engineer from the city. Marion was not an only child, although, by the wealth she inherited on her father's death, you could have been fooled. She had been his sole care provider in the run-up to his death, and in that respect, if her siblings joined the destitute of the city on receiving little after his death, she didn't much care. The only thing Marion Gilchrist liked was her own company and exceptionally fine jewellery. The only true vice of her somewhat substantial wealth outside of her home and its furnishings. She also tolerated the presence of a maid, a girl in her early 20s, called Helen Lambie. The house which Lambie was employed to clean was rather unusual in the construction of its access. The building itself stood 3 high, and Marion Gilchrist resided on the 2nd floor. She had, however, a separate door from the ground floor apartment. Her entry doorway provided access to both her own and a 3rd floor apartment through a rising hallway, typically referred to as a close in Scotland. In terms of neighbours, Marion had the Adams family residing underneath her on the ground floor, and the 3rd floor above, which lay empty. Marion's vice in jewellery was not simply 1 or 2 small pieces. She owned nearly £3,000 worth of jewellery, which adjusted for inflation would place her collection at somewhere north of £300,000 today. The unfortunate aspect of this was that the sheer value of her collection made her incredibly suspicious and fearful of both storing and wearing her jewellery. She regularly mentioned a fear of being robbed and stored incredibly valuable pieces in resourceful, if not a little strange, hiding spots within her house. The house itself was made robbery-proof on this basis. There were strict orders to keep the windows locked and 2 strong locks installed to keep the door shut. There was a strict protocol to request entry, which included pulling on a bell hung outside the property. If successfully answered, this would permit entry to the close. Once in the close, provided you passed the further scrutiny of Marion at the peephole, the locks would be disengaged to allow entry. Marion's paranoia about robbery even stretched so far as to pre-arrange a coded series of distress calls to be given to her downstairs neighbour. 3 knocks on the floor to indicate to them that she was in some measure of trouble, which her admittedly extensive for the time security measures had failed to prevent. There were some events which lent the paranoia of Marion some credence. Her dog died in autumn of 1908, and the cause of death was given as acute poisoning. This, in and of itself, wouldn't have been so distressing. The dog may have simply found its way into something poisonous. However, soon after the death of her dog, a well-heeled man, descriptions of his appearance differed in some ways and agreed in others, was often seen loitering near her house at varying times of day, and with varying degrees of care as to whether he had been seen. One of the constants about his behaviour whilst loitering was that the man stared intently at the West Princes Street home where Marion Gilchrist lived, and she, no doubt, felt his gaze. Set amongst the dimly lit rooms of Glasgow's illegal underworld betting fraternity at the same time, Marion Gilchrist was becoming increasingly erratic in relation to fears over her property due to the watcher outside, sat a well-heeled and well-versed man bearing a fine short moustache named Oscar Slater. He was a German-born Jew who could count New York, London, Edinburgh, Paris and Glasgow among the cities he had once called home. Life had not always been gambling dens and glamorous cities for him either. He had been born Oscar Joseph Lechsteiner, one of 4 children born to Adolf and Pauline Lechsteiner in Opel, then in Germany, although now part of southern Poland, on January 8, 1872. After having fled his native land to avoid military service, he had taken to gambling as a means to fund his lifestyle. In the early 1890s, he had become a bookmaker in London. He flittered between using the surnames Anderson and Slater over his own, although he predominantly settled on Slater as his preferred pseudonym. Oscar, with a K, was anglicised too, to the softer and less genteel English C. The notion of Beau was influenced by his want to remove the Jewishness from even his secret identity in a time where displaying Jewishness increasingly made you a target for violence. Slater was no stranger to Glasgow, having been to the city 3 times. He had been in early 1901, marrying a local woman whom he proceeded to neglect once she had become particularly thoughtful, and some may say demanding, in respect of his hard-won cash. He fled the city to avoid her solicitations, adopting aliases as he went to avoid detection. He had a brief return to the city in 1905, prior to returning once more in October of 1908, presumably free of the burden of his former wife's investigative prowess. He was followed thereafter by his partner, Antoine, and their maid, Catherine. To house the three, accommodation was sourced at 69 St George's Road, a few hundred yards from Marion Gilchrist's own abode. Oscar had to be particularly careful when he applied for the tenancy. Glasgow may have come a long way in some of its attitudes, but 1908 was the time of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish need apply. The dogs in the exceptionally crude and racist metaphor were the Jewish community. From vampires to dogs to golems and a host of other disgusting metaphors, the Jewish community were maligned in print in the worst of ways. So, when Oscar met with the landlord of St George's Road, he went with the most British of his pseudonyms. The tenancy was signed for by Oscar Anderson, alias of Oscar Slater, alias of Oscar Joseph Lechsteiner. In respect of the flat itself, he visited a hardware store on November 10 of that same year to purchase tools to deal with the immediately necessary and in time to come unavoidable repairs which came with any house of the time. Explaining his wealth was another problem for the man. Oscar varyingly portrayed himself as either a dentist or a dealer in precious stones, depending on who was spoken to. But his real earnings came from gambling. He was loath to be without the status symbols that made being trusted as a gambling man a certainty. He wore fine clothes in the dandy style of the time and had a particularly fine watch. In December of that year, that same watch was in need of repair, so it was sent by mail to the manufacturer, Dent's, in London. Gambling took buy-in too, and this meant money wasn't always on hand, so Oscar occasionally pawned his goods. At one point in November of 1908, Oscar pawned a crescent-shaped brooch set with diamonds in exchange for £20, which would be in the region of £2,500 today. All of these in singularity seem perfectly mundane and understandable. Unfortunately for Oscar Slater, these small decisions and actions taken in culmination, most of which were based solely around making life in Glasgow work for him, were about to have some drastic consequences in respect of his liberty. As the afternoon of December 21, 1908 dawned, Marion Gilchrist realised she had bills to pay. Alighting at the town, she made payment on her dues, then returned at 4:30 to eat. The night remained quiet and peaceful, until at 7:05, Rowena, who lived with the Adams family downstairs from Marion, noticed the watcher had once again returned. However, when met with her cool stare, he quickly stalked off into the gloomy night of the Glasgow winter. Heading off a few minutes after him was Helen Lambie, who was sent to fetch her employer's evening paper. Alarmingly, 2 minutes after Helen left, at 7 p.m, the Adams family below heard the warning signal provided to them by Marion Gilchrist for situations in which her life was in jeopardy, that of 3 knocks on the floor of the flat. The man of the house, Arthur, sprang into action, tugging at the bell which would enable Marion Gilchrist to let them into the close for her flat above. There was no response. Hearing a sound like breaking sticks, a sound he supposed was the maid making kindling for the fire, but little else, Arthur returned to his own family in the flat. He declared it must have been a false alarm. His family who had remained in the house painted a different picture. They had noted noises which indicated to them that something sinister and violent was ongoing, and urged Arthur to return and check on Marion once more. When he returned to pull the rope bell, he spotted Helen Lambie coming up the street. Given that he had presumed the noise of splintering wood to be Lambie creating kindling, her appearance at the door at the same time as him was startling. Mentioning the noises he had heard to her, Helen Lambie seemed unconcerned, saying that it would have been a pulley system within the flat used for drying clothes, which had simply fallen to the ground. Despite this, Arthur followed her up the stairs just for certainty. When they arrived at the door, Helen put in her key and entered the property. From a rear room of the house, a man walked directly towards the pair. He did not look dishevelled or out of place. However, once he had gotten past Arthur Adams, he streaked off down the stairs, in Adams' words, like greased lightning. Helen carried on, unperturbed, and checked on the pulley system. Shouting through to Arthur that it was fine, she then proceeded to investigate the spare bedroom. Seeing nothing wrong, she entered the dining room. A distressed call went up from Helen to summon Arthur. Laying upon the hearth rug on the floor, with a further rug thrown over her body, lay the bludgeoned and dying body of Marion Gilchrist. Her skull had been smashed so severely, her face was almost unrecognisable. Mercifully, she drew only a few moments of breath before passing from her injuries. Acting immediately, Arthur Adams chased off into the night after the assailant, while Helen Lambie headed for the rooms of Marion's niece, Margaret Burrell, to inform her of her death. The woman, dubbed varyingly erratic and paranoid by those who knew her, Marion Gilchrist, at 82 years of age, might not have been remiss to take her security so seriously after all. Lambie arrived at Marion's niece Margaret Burrell's house soon after the discovery. As the pair were talking, Arthur Adams had abandoned the fruitless chase of the unknown man in Marion Gilchrist's house, and instead had focused his efforts to summon a policeman and a doctor to West Princes Street. A bloodied chair leg was identified by the doctor as being the murder weapon, both corresponding to the damage visible on Marion Gilchrist's body, and being so caked in blood, it seemed an obvious truth. The wide pattern indicated that the killer had stood whilst Marion was on the ground, defenceless. Interestingly, there was some small amounts of money displayed openly within the house, which had not been touched by the assailant. Similarly, there were pieces of jewellery on Marion's dressing table which had not been stolen, save for one crescent-shaped diamond brooch of a value of £50, or slightly over £5,000 in modern terms. The flat door had not been forced, and all the multitude of locks remained intact. Various items were broken into and papers strewn across the floor, but it seemed as though whatever the killer had come to seek, he had left without. Arthur and Helen were asked about the appearance of the man who had walked calmly past them at the threshold of the house. Arthur, who was short-sighted and not in possession of his glasses, having rushed to the aid of Marion Gilchrist, was able to give little more than an incredibly generic description. Helen Lambie also said she had been unable to identify the man, save for him wearing a grey overcoat and a cloth hat. Where does Oscar Slater come into this story, you may be wondering, save for his accommodation being somewhat close to that of Marion Gilchrist? Especially given that by December of 1908, Oscar himself was growing tired of Glasgow and preparing to leave. In the 2 and a little months he had been in the city, she had taken from him more than she had given. There was a recession ongoing, and it had even hit the takings at the gambling halls. Any gambler worth his salt knows a bad bet, so he had made arrangements in the early winter to leave the city. He was going to move to San Francisco, 5,000 miles away, after being sounded out about the move by a friend named John Devoto. In fact, by the time that December 21, 1908 had rolled around, Oscar Slater was almost entirely ready to go. He had even gone so far as to find a new tenant for his flat to keep the landlord at St George's Road sweet upon his departure. As Oscar Slater said goodbye to Glasgow, he had a Michael Corleone moment over 80 years before the man himself. Just as he prepared to get himself out of Glasgow, circumstances found a way to pull him back in. Those circumstances were a police bulletin issued slightly before 10 p.m. on the night of Marion Gilchrist's murder. The testimony of a teenage girl named Mary Barrowman and an overzealous bicycle salesman. At 9:40 p.m, the police issued their first internal bulletin relating to the crime. The description given was largely analogous to the facts told to the police, informing them to be on the lookout for a man somewhere between 25 and 30, and clean-shaven, wearing a long grey overcoat and a dark cap in respect of the murder of Marion Gilchrist, who they thoughtfully referred to simply as an old lady. The middle of the bulletin largely focused on the jewellery which had gone missing, including the crescent-shaped gold brooch with diamonds. The last line read, "Also warn pawns on opening regarding brooch and keep a sharp lookout." 2 days later, on December 23, Mary Barrowman was brought forward as a potential witness by her mother. She had noted that just after 7 p.m. on the night in question, she had seen the man come out of the closed door at Marion Gilchrist's home. She described him as being 28 to 30 years of age, tall and slim with no facial hair, long features with a slight bend in the nose to the right, and wearing a fawn overcoat jacket and a tweed cloth hat. She later confirmed the type of tweed to be a Donegal cap, a very particular type of tweed hat. The differences in the testimony, grey coats and fawn coats, cloth hats and Donegal caps, initially led the police to believe that there were 2 suspects involved, and they issued a news report in this fashion. Given that Oscar Slater was in his mid-30s, stockily built and moustached, and a nose which did not careen off centre, it seemed unlikely that suspicion would fall on him. That was until Christmas Day of 1908, when Alan McLean, the aforementioned overzealous bicycle salesman, told the police of a Jew he knew of who had been trying to sell a pawn ticket for a gold crescent brooch inset with diamonds, called Oscar Slater. They now had their murderer, so they thought. When the police attended St George's Road, Oscar's maid initially denied the man was home, and indeed that no one named Oscar had ever lived there, insisting the tenant's name was Anderson. However, a cursory glance at the flat revealed a return parcel from Dents in London, which was marked both in the name of Oscar Slater and the care of Anderson, at the address in which the investigators now stood. It turned out that the maid's insistence that there was no one named Oscar now at that flat was true, for he had indeed left the city with his partner on the night train for Liverpool, then on to the Lusitania, headed for New York. He had booked the tickets under a false name, that of Otto Sando, a habit he had perfected and ingrained from his years of running and hiding from his first wife in Glasgow. His presence on the Lusitania and the false name was not yet known to investigators, but the departure from Glasgow itself was something which the investigators found to be highly indicative of his now predetermined guilt. In search of information about Oscar, they shook down his associates from the local gambling halls. They even pinpointed where he had pawned the brooch he was in possession of, at a high street pawn shop on Glasgow's Sauchiehall Street. Helen Lambie was summoned to authenticate the brooch, and by extension, Oscar Slater's guilt. Except, she said that wasn't Marion Gilchrist's brooch. Marion's brooch had a single row of diamonds, yet this piece had 3. Even worse for the investigators, the shop worker noted that the pawn slip had been issued on November 18, 1908. Quite how Oscar Slater was to have pawned a brooch in November that he had not supposedly stolen until an event 1 month in the future required a knowledge of mental gymnastics as yet unknown to humankind. Yet the police were committed to nailing him for the crime anyway. He was foreign, he was Jewish, and to them, that meant he was guilty. So, on December 26, 1908, the bulletin was revised. In place of the 25 to 30 age range, the age was set firmly and erroneously at 30. In place of clean shaven was may have a moustache of a few days' growth, and he was also now the proud purported owner of both a cloth hat and a Donegal cap, as well as a light and a dark coloured overcoat. For every stumbling block the confusing testimony had presented, there was an answer. He was simply, according to the police, both men described rolled into one, mistakes and all. One notably absent feature from his identification bulletin was his ability to pawn items in the past that he hadn't stolen until the future. Eventually, the cover story of Otto Sandal was rumbled, and a wire sent by the authorities to those on the boat to detain Oscar Slater on suspicion of the murder of Marion Gilchrist. He was apprehended on January 2, 1909, when he arrived in New York. He was sent to the Tombs, a god-forsaken hole where prisoners awaited extradition, whereby he penned numerous letters to his contacts back in Glasgow. He assured all who asked that prior to his arrest, he had never heard of Marion Gilchrist, and that a trial would prove his innocence. In mid-January, Helen Lambie, Arthur Adams, and Mary Barrowman were brought by boat to New York at the bequest of the detective in charge of the case, Piper, and the chief criminal officer of Glasgow's Sheriff Court. They arrived by the 25th, when Oscar Slater's extradition, and indeed his very future, was put into the hands of those who had just sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. Given that the pawn story had been a bust, the dishonourable for the Crown had instead primed the witnesses by showing them photos of Oscar Slater prior to the hearing. Despite having said she was unable to see the man involved's face on the night in question, this did not stop Helen Lambie identifying Oscar Slater as the man who had run from Marion Gilchrist's house on December 21, 1908. Mary Barrowman stated that Oscar Slater was very like the man she had seen. Arthur Adams went on to state he was not unlike him, yet he had not noticed any of the particulars which Helen Lambie and Mary Barrowman had so easily discerned. As the hearing proceeded, the case of the Crown looked increasingly set to fail, yet astonishingly, Oscar Slater stood and informed the hearing there would be no further need to argue. He would return to Scotland and stand trial for the crime to clear his name once and for all. When Oscar arrived in Scotland, his possessions were examined. Chief among them were a small hammer and a fawn overcoat. He also had some cloth hats, although none matched the ones for which the police were looking. Given the prosecution had long since determined it was impossible for the brooch to be evidence of anything other than the investigators' determination to see Oscar Slater guilty, no matter the circumstances. These, alongside primed witness identifications, were to be the Crown's key elements of evidence when Oscar Slater's trial began on May 3rd, 1909. The media, then as now, turned the circus factor up to 11. Only, rather than phone hacking and leaking emails, this time it was plain old-fashioned bigotry. It wasn't quite a trial by media, but the public were baying for justice for a defenceless old woman slain indiscriminately in her own home. And the media and the police were offering the alien, Jewish Oscar Slater up as their sacrificial lamb. First to testify was Helen Lambie. While giving testimony, Helen Lambie had a further epiphany and stated she could now categorically identify Oscar Slater as the man in question, and managed to identify his overcoat as that of the murderers before it had even been fully entered into evidence for inspection. Mary Barrowman too had transformed from a shaky witness to a fully fledged star. She identified everything about Oscar Slater as correlating with the man she had seen fleeing Marion Gilchrist's house. It stunk of a fit-up, because it was a fit-up. Only Arthur Adams had the gall to say that he couldn't condemn a man when he couldn't see his features in such a fleeting glimpse. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that so-called investigators picked the easiest two to influence, and realised that given Arthur Adams had forgotten his glasses, they didn't have to compel him to perjure himself. Maybe given the anti-Jewish sentiment at the time, it didn't take much compelling. Even worse for Oscar Slater was the expert testimony of John Gleester, a medical professor. His testimony noted that the small hammer found on Oscar Slater as he willingly submitted himself to be returned to Scotland could have been the murder weapon used against Marion Gilchrist. This ignored the Occam's razor fact that the blood-soaked table leg which was left next to her body explained the whole situation much more neatly. But then, this case wasn't to show justice. It was to remove an alien, as per the Aliens Act, from dignified Scottish society. The defence brought up the brooch lead to the police officers on the stand, although they dealt with it rather ham-fistedly and failed to drive home the fact that once the brooch theory was dead, Oscar Slater should have went off the radar of the police entirely. Their entire case was built around the theory that Marion Gilchrist was murdered by this man as he robbed her. Shutting down the element of the case focused on robbery would have dealt a mean blow to the insubstantial prosecution case. He even allowed the prosecution's witnesses to suggest both in their own testimony and the cross-examination of his maid that he was a pimp rather than a gambler, damaging his reputation in the already suspicious eyes of the jury. Compounding this, rather than throwing character testimony out, which is not admissible as evidence typically in Scotland, the judge made defamatory remarks about Oscar Slater to the jury. The killer blow to Oscar Slater's defence was that a woman at the subway station identified him as having purchased a ticket around 30 minutes after the murder. Oscar Slater may have become pressingly aware that despite his obvious innocence, due to a prejudicial society, a corrupt police investigation, and lawyers failing in their basic duties to their client, he was fast getting in over his head. The closing argument sealed Oscar Slater's fate. It was a short hop, skip and a jump from pimp to murderer, according to the prosecution, and the 1908 sensibilities of the jury agreed. Despite the fact that Oscar Slater was neither of these things, 9 of his 15 peers found him guilty of the murder of Marion Gilchrist. The 6 who varyingly voted the case against him to be not proven or not guilty were not enough to stop the majority verdict, as they would have been had the case been tried in England at the time. Upon realising his fate, Oscar Slater burst into an impassioned defence of himself and his conduct to the judge. He had not taken the stand as a witness. The words fell on deaf ears, and deaf words were to follow. Oscar Slater was condemned to be hanged until death within Glasgow Prison on Duke Street in the city's East End on May 27, 1909. The sheer determination of the prosecution to find Oscar Slater guilty was an immense hurdle to overcome, a fact illustrated in later years when it was determined they were in possession of a statement from Margaret Burrell, the sister-in-law of Marion Gilchrist, stating that when Helen Lambie had come to her house in the aftermath of Marion's discovery, she had stated that not only had she seen the killer clearly, she knew who the man was, and it wasn't Oscar Slater.
The best in internet and entertainment is here, and it's all powered by Xfinity for one unbelievable value. Introducing breakthrough Wi-Fi speed, now faster than a gig. That's enough to handle every device in the house and then some. And with X1, you get access to live TV and top streaming apps. Upgrade today with Xfinity. Check out our internet and TV offers. And now through March 15th, ask how to get a free upgrade to gig speed for a year. Now 20% faster. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY, or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Actual speeds vary and not guaranteed. Gig offer limited to standard plus more with 2-year agreement and compatible X-Fi gateway. The best in internet and entertainment is here, and it's all powered by Xfinity for one unbelievable value. Introducing breakthrough Wi-Fi speed, now faster than a gig. That's enough to handle every device in the house and then some. And with X1, you get access to live TV and top streaming apps. Upgrade today with Xfinity. Check out our internet and TV offers. And now through March 15th, ask how to get a free upgrade to gig speed for a year. Now 20% faster. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY, or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Actual speeds vary and not guaranteed. Gig offer limited to standard plus more with 2-year agreement and compatible X-Fi gateway.
If you're looking for a fun way to relax, then check out the app June's Journey. I've recently been playing and can't get enough. I find it a great way to unwind as I can relax while playing, but it keeps me on my toes with small details challenging my sense of observation and eye for detail. Like some of my favourite podcasts, the game throws you back into a different era. Set in the roaring 1920s, hundreds of colourful and carefully crafted room decors give each level a great backdrop to this hidden object mystery game. You take on the role of June as she returns home to her family's estate to find her sister murdered and embarks on her search to solve the crime. Along the way, you will uncover what is the start of many family secrets while travelling the world and getting June out of tricky situations. With over 3 million players of the game, it's clear to see why June's Journey is a hit. You can download June's Journey for free on the Apple App Store or Google Play by following the link in today's show notes. As Oscar Slater's solicitors looked to avoid their client being hanged, Mary Barrowman was celebrating a windfall. She had received the reward for the discovery of Marion Gilchrist's killer, a princely £200. Not a bad payday for remembering exactly the right things on exactly the right cues. Luckily for Oscar Slater, he too would have some small good luck in his life. His sentence to death was changed to that of hard labour. Having hit rock bottom, he had managed to climb to the safety of one of the rocks sitting there. That rock looked out over a sea view, and its name was Peterhead Prison. Rocks were to be the foundation of his time at Peterhead. Awoken in the morning to smash them and transfer them in the quarry, then back to bed to sleep on what felt like 1 in the evening. By 1910, he was struggling, and his conduct and letters to the outside world reflected it. On the outside, in that same year, William Ruffhead, a Scots law commentator, released a damning document outlining his perceived failings in the prosecution of Oscar Slater, having attended the trial in its entirety. He believed it rightly to be unconscionable for a man to have been treated with such disdain when there was little, if any, evidence to connect him to the crime at hand. Ruffhead even lobbied for Oscar Slater to be released, given the contradictions contained within the case. By 1911, Oscar himself had taken up the fight, expanding his letter writing to include not just his family, but those who he felt may be beneficial in securing his release. Soon, the most important player in the defence of Oscar Slater was to enter the domain, and that man was Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle was one of Scotland's most prominent Victorian exports. The incredible wit behind the world-famous consultant detective Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle himself had proven his hand numerous times in unpicking cases which had unsatisfactory outcomes. Once he had been made aware of the facts pertaining to the Oscar Slater case, he wrote a book, The Case of Oscar Slater, which was published in August of 1912, priced in line with the common man's pocket, with typical Conan Doyle foresight and intelligence. His stance on the matter, on which he wrote, can be summed up by the document's first few lines, which read, "It is impossible to read and weigh the facts in connection with the conviction of Oscar Slater in May 1909 at the High Court in Edinburgh, without feeling deeply dissatisfied with the proceedings and morally certain that justice was not done. Under the circumstances of Scotch law, I am not clear how far any remedy exists, but it will, in my opinion, be a serious scandal if the man be allowed upon such evidence to spend his life in a convict prison." Arthur Conan Doyle displayed the same deductive reasoning which his most famously penned character did with regularity. Point by point, he disputed the position and arguments of the prosecution, and even the stances of the witnesses themselves. Conan Doyle's book was made possible due to the open-handedness of William Ruffhead, who had provided Conan Doyle with all of the ammunition he had sourced through his time at the trial and beyond. But in Conan Doyle's capable hands, Ruffhead knew that his facts were loaded weapons which would do harm to the whole sordid stitch-up. One interesting facet of the case which Conan Doyle remarked upon at length was Lambie's apparent ease with a stranger being in the house of her supposedly paranoid and distinctly anti-guest employer. Even more strangely, allowing for the fact she may have simply been struck silent in the moment, she acted with the same composure when she must surely have seen the contents of the room she entered were disturbed. Only upon finding her employer's body did she alert Arthur Adams that something was wrong. This tied into another theory which Conan Doyle presented, that the killer must have had keys, given Marion Gilchrist's penchant for locks and safety. There were only 2 key holders for the flat in question. In addition, the murderer had went directly to the room where Marion Gilchrist secreted her jewellery. Everything in the narrative suggested an inside job. Oscar Slater had no more insider information than a passer-by on the street, but Helen Lambie did, and her instructive testimony helped pull every eye in the courtroom away from her and towards what they hated instead: the government-mandated reason for their meagre lives, those aliens of the Act of 1906. Unfortunately, by this point, Oscar Slater had become almost institutionalised. Despite having belief in his innocence across the strata of society, he simply accepted that he was going to rot for a crime he had never committed. That was not the case on the street. One of the initial investigators even had misgivings of their own. John Thompson Trench was almost certain of Oscar's innocence. Much like Conan Doyle, he felt there were too many contradictions to come to the conclusions they had, and had informed a friend of some of the inconsistencies he had noted, such as the changing testimony of the two female witnesses. His friend went to Conan Doyle with this information and dropped a final bombshell. He noted that Trench had told him one final thing about Helen Lambie. Margaret Burrell had sworn in the aftermath that Helen Lambie had told her she knew the face and name of the murderer who had ran past her at the threshold of Marion Gilchrist's house. This information had been deliberately buried by police, intent on pushing Helen Lambie to nail Oscar Slater. But finally, the proverbial cat had come out of the bag. And at that, an inquiry was to be held in March of 1914. The inquiry was one in name only. During the proceedings, Trench told the entire story of his interview with Margaret Burrell. He told of how she had recounted Helen Lambie's admission to her, and the biggest reveal of all was that she had named a member of Glasgow's high society as the murderer at the door. The man she had named was Francis Charteris. Francis Charteris was a well-respected doctor and married to a Glasgow manufacturing heiress. The Charteris family were also near relations of Marion Gilchrist, and Francis had the closest relationship with her, having spent a great deal of time and money attempting to win her affections. He had even bought her a dog, the same dog that had been poisoned in the run-up to her murder. They had grown apart when Francis realised that Marion was unlikely to give him a penny of her future inheritance. Motive? It sounded something like one. Trench then told of how his superiors had told him it was not the man who had been named, and that line of inquiry was closed. It almost feels familiar, doesn't it? When it came time for the police and the witnesses from the trial to testify, they too cast severe doubt on Trench's testimony. Worse still, even Margaret Burrell took the stand to say that the testimony given by Trench from their interview was not what she had said in the slightest. The whole situation seemed something between a Kafka novel and a theatrical farce. Only one man other than Trench testified on the side of Oscar Slater, stating he had seen him at his own house when the prosecution alleged he was fleeing a murder scene. He was, like Trench before him, summarily disregarded. Oscar Slater's sentence was upheld. Then, in true Kafka fashion, Trench was released from his duties as a police officer, and Cook, his loyal friend who had sought Conan Doyle's assistance, was arrested and sentenced to jail for fabricated charges of criminal reset. Defending the truth was beginning to be a dangerous game to play. This fact may be why for 10 years Oscar Slater was left to rot in jail, his most ardent defenders either having joined him, being kowtowed by the pressure and fear of the corruption surrounding them, or in the case of Trench, died prematurely in unfair disgrace. Slater himself had almost given up, yet he was afforded one last shot at the return of his liberty and reputation when on January 23, 1925, William Gordon was released from His Majesty's prison, Peterhead. Hidden beneath his false teeth as he exited the dank gloom of Peterhead was an impassioned plea another prisoner and latterly friend called Oscar Slater had begged of him to deliver to his only hope of salvation, Arthur Conan Doyle. The letter, which was concealed beneath William Gordon's false teeth, was read verbatim at the beginning of this tale. Gordon himself had replied to Oscar a month later, confirming that he had indeed made delivery of the message, and Conan Doyle once again promised to return to the support of Oscar's cause. More astonishingly, he had actually travelled to the south of England to hand-deliver the letter. Conan Doyle immediately wrote beseeching letters to those in power. Unusually for a man of his considerable reputation, these went unanswered, or the substance of the letters ignored to the same result. A confidant and colleague of Conan Doyle's, Glasgow Offor Park, published a further scathing review of the case in 1927, only with one significant difference in the content. This time, the author was able to frame the case in the context of Trench and Cook's actions back in 1913 and 1914, especially the testimony of Margaret Burrell. A further document was provided which stated that in an evidence room discussion, the brooch, the key initial lead which provoked the police to respond to Oscar Slater, was marked as being very much less strong compared to other evidence they had gathered, such as Margaret Burrell's testimony. Conan Doyle used Cook's book to invoke the help of Ramsay MacDonald, then Prime Minister of Great Britain, who agreed that it appeared a significant injustice had been done. Other gifted author friends contributed to the cause too. Soon, the injustices done to Oscar Slater had gathered momentum. Then, Helen Lambie, chased to America, gave a tell-all interview in which she noted that she had initially given testimony that it had been the high society man whom she had identified to Margaret Burrell. When the police had told her he was not the man whom she had seen and it was implausible, she found things easier if she were amenable to identifying the suspect they had to hand, Oscar Slater. Then Mary Barrowman too recanted her testimony. She implicated the Fiscal's office and the police in steering her towards identifying Slater, noting she was just 15 years of age and was easily swayed. The Crown had no option but to hear Oscar Slater's case at the newly established Criminal Appeals Court. With the might of famed Scots lawyer Craigie Aitchison at his side, the original case by the prosecution was dismantled piece by piece. Then the judges retired to come to a verdict. The world had seemed to come so far in respect of finally recognising their mistakes, yet old prejudices were still to be shown. On all points of law relating to the murder of Marion Gilchrist, the judges upheld that there was no erring in law on behalf of either the prosecution, the jury, or the judge, and the charges would not be overturned. However, in directing the jury in relation to character statements made without evidence about Oscar Slater, they ruled that the trial judge had erred in his management of the trial. As such, the result of the trial would require to be set aside. Oscar Slater had won, technically, but he had won on the smallest of loopholes, a loophole that meant the corruption of the police and Fiscal's office, of self-serving and intimidated witnesses, was not in the record. He was not given the removal of the stain of association or of murder. He was a free man, they opined, as a judge had made a mistake. Despite this, battered, bruised and almost dead from his struggles with the justice system, Oscar Slater walked a free man. In the aftermath, he was sent a letter to commiserate his treatment at the hands of the establishment by his saviour, Arthur Conan Doyle. The reply which Oscar Slater sent to Conan Doyle is as heartwarming a message as one is likely to see. It is included in full in the show notes for this episode. Unfortunately, their friendship was not to remain. Having been awarded £6,000 in compensation for his wrongful conviction, Oscar Slater elected to not repay any of the debts those who had so courageously defended him incurred. This caused Arthur Conan Doyle to take significant umbrage with him. Unfortunately, Conan Doyle died soon after in 1930 at 71 years of age. Oscar Slater refused to leave Scotland despite his treatment, marrying a local in 1930, then settling down in Ayr, where he died in 1948 of natural causes. The case is widely regarded as Scotland's most egregious miscarriage of justice, and has been used as both a case for review and a case study in training police to avoid miscarriages of justice in Scotland, little that may mean to Oscar Slater. But all of this leaves one significant and pressing question. Who really did kill Marion Gilchrist in December of 1908? Unfortunately, there is no way to tell. Francis Charteris perhaps had motive, and he was the key suspect for Arthur Conan Doyle. Or perhaps it was the key holder to the flat, Helen Lambie, who devised a plan with a further criminal partner. It seems unlikely there were any further criminal elements that could have been interposed, but it's not out of the question. The only thing we can state with certainty is that the fit-up allowed the real killer to walk the streets of Glasgow a free man.
The best in internet and entertainment is here, and it's all powered by Xfinity for one unbelievable value. Introducing breakthrough Wi-Fi speed, now faster than a gig. That's enough to handle every device in the house and then some. And with X1, you get access to live TV and top streaming apps. Upgrade today with Xfinity. Check out our internet and TV offers. And now through March 15th, ask how to get a free upgrade to gig speed for a year. Now 20% faster. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY, or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Actual speeds vary and not guaranteed. Gig offer limited to standard plus more with 2-year agreement and compatible X5 gateway.